Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We're truly delighted to welcome Dr. Andrew Lison to Business Talk. Professor Andrew is a media theorist and associate professor in the Department of Media Study at the University of Buffalo, SUNY, where he examines how digital media reshapes social relations and everyday life since the mid-20th century. Trained in modern culture and media at Brown University and drawing on earlier experience as an information technologist and system administrator. His work bridges technical infrastructures with critical theory to show how computation and automation reorganize culture, politics, and economic life. His research spans software and hardware studies, science and technology studies, film and media theory, aesthetics and avant-garde, and the critical digital humanities, with a particular interest in the material and cultural impact of digital mediation. Current book projects include New Media at the End of History, which situates the rise of digital multimedia alongside the collapse of state socialism in the late 1980s and early 90s, and 100% utilization, a study of the limits of computation under conditions of growing socio-economic dependence on automation. His writing appears in journals such as New Formation and Science Fiction Studies, as well as in several edited collections, including The Global Cities in South and Vision, Media Counterculture, Revolt, which he co-edited with Dr. Timothy Scott Brown. Across these venues, Professor Lison develops a historically grounded account of how digital media absorbs previously distinct domains of social life, offering a rigorous technically informed perspective on the politics and aesthetics of contemporary mediation. In today's episode, Professor Andrew Lison joins us to unpack some of the big ideas from his groundbreaking book, 100% Utilization, Computation and Labor after Moore's Law, and explore what they mean for work and technology today. Professor Andrew, welcome to Business Talk. It's truly an honor to have you with us today.
Thanks, Deepak. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Professor, your concept of 100% utilization reframes a technical systems metric as a global socio-economic condition. How do you explain this idea to someone in business or policy? And what practical signals should they watch for that we are approaching this limit?
Well, I think the metric holds even somewhat at the level of business and policy. So, people who are in those fields should watch for the amount of compute that they're using, literally how busy their computers and servers are. As I'm sure we'll talk about as we go through, we're really in the midst of kind of a historical run on compute thanks to AI and data centers, right? And there's a concern that there's a legitimately inexhaustible demand in that area as far as AI goes, thanks to the way that it works, which I think we'll also be talking about in a little bit. But of course, utilization can be monitored in other areas as well as in the incorporation of AI into these other areas. So, we think about, ChatGPT or whatever, but as businesses use more AI for more of their business processes, then AI will be crunching numbers for those purposes as well as just for kind of general GPT usage. So business leaders can watch for how much compute time they are using internally as a result of AI as well. And as computing power is more fully utilized, different approaches to software efficiency and business processes, I think, will become increasingly necessary. And that is sort of the main kind of point I'd like to get across to the more like high level, kind of executive summary.
Professor, the book opens by contrasting science fiction fantasies of total computational power with the physical stagnation of processor clock speeds after the mid-2000s. How has this tension between cultural imagination and material limits shaped real-world technology strategy over the last 2 decades?
Well, as I say in the book, we've become accustomed to this idea that computing power will continually grow, right? That, next year's computers or 2 years from now, their computers will be, so much faster and so much be able to do more than the computers we have today. And I think what we're seeing now with data centers, again, evinces that this at best comes at a huge cost, right? And we're now in a situation where We have to have specialized software, particularly AI software, right? Neural networks and things like that. And we have to buy more GPUs and use more power to get them to do more things, right? Rather than relying on the chips themselves to get faster and more efficient, which they still do to some extent, but not nearly the way they've done over the last, 60 years or something like that, right? So we are kind of in this moment, and it started. I was, in my book, I sort of trace it to about a little over 20 years ago in 2004, which is when the raw clock speed of individual processors plateaued, right? And then, as a result of that, we've gotten into this situation with AI, and not just AI, but any kind of, the benefit I talk about in the book about AI is that it is designed to be parallelized almost by default, right? Each like neuron can be considered a kind of information processor, and so it can be farmed out to an individual processing unit chip, and then the results can be aggregated back together. Software traditionally hasn't really worked like that. We've had to rewrite operating systems and productivity suites and things like that in order to make them do multi-processing work. But that's what we've had to do basically since 2004. And a guy named Herb Sutter wrote a great article about this that I draw on in the book. Since that time, we've had to do that in order to kind of continue to make it appear or feel, if you will, as if computers were getting faster, right? So the tension is already playing out, the fact that there are these material limits that we've had to work around for the past 20 years, and more recently we discovered that AI frameworks kind of are automatically do this, and I think that's a big reason why we're looking at AI so much and why AI is getting so much of a push, is because it can take advantage of thousands of CPUs at once. With it's basically written to do that, as opposed to your web browser or something like that. So when we hear these promises about AI, the promises are sort of built on this idea that they are kind of at the cutting edge of using all, most efficiently or maximally using all processing power. But of course, AI has a lot of problems in the fact that it's kind of non-deterministic. It doesn't always give a fixed answer to a question. We don't really know how it works, all this kind of stuff, which is something that I go into in the book.
Professor, you argue that the looming end of Moore's law forces us to rethink automation and the replacement of human labor with machines. In your view, which kind of work are most exposed to these computational limits, and which forms of labor become newly visible or valuable as a result?
Yeah, this is really interesting because the current threat, anticipated again by some other people I cite in the book, like Randall Collins, is to white collar work, right? We've heard a lot about the threat of automation, particularly again AI, to white collar work. And it turns out that some more physical tasks, blue collar and/or quote unquote unskilled work, are actually more difficult to automate, particularly if they revolve around fine motor skills and things like that, right? They are obviously working on robots. I'm sure we've all seen the videos of robots folding laundry or washing dishes or whatever. But it turns out that, interestingly, those kind of physical, real world, non-symbolic manipulation kind of activities are a little more difficult for computers to handle and require, a lot of computing power and a lot of training. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And as I conclude in the later parts of the book, I think that the labor that's valued is that machines struggle to replace. So including the things I just talked about, as well as things like care work, which I think people may be reticent to entrust to machines for a variety of reasons, right? Technically, care work is classified, for example, by the autonomists as a kind of immaterial labor. So in that sense, just like programming, so they often conflate symbolic and effective tasks, right? But it's likely that some affective work, like parenting or senior care, won't be popular to farm out to machines, although I know there are efforts to do this, especially in senior care. Even if they can do it, because there's an emotional connection that's sort of central to that kind of work. So that's one area where I think maybe we could, we would end up reassessing value. Of course, I think an economy based primarily on care that is not, producing things is a problem as well. So there's more to it than that. But I do think that's one area of undervalued work. And I also kind of hold out some hope that even some of the more advanced symbolic work won't be assimilable. I mean, maybe this is sort of, self-flattery or whatever, but I would like to think that, an AI could not write the book that I wrote, for instance, right? Although obviously it can write a lot of things. Maybe it would be disinclined to write the book that I wrote because of the topic matter or whatever. But nevertheless, I think there is some room there for, advanced thought, or at least I would like to think so.
Professor, Chapter 2 connects cheap fabrication economics with the broader dynamics of global capitalism. How does the rising cost and complexity of producing ever denser integrated circuits feedback into financial markets, platform businesses, and the way firms think about scaling today?
Well, I think that firms, again, maybe outside of these current AI ventures and data centers, but businesses more broadly, don't really think much about how they're supported by computation, and that leaves them vulnerable to the end of Moore's law, precisely because they only sort of dimly take computing resources into account when planning workflows and so on and so forth. And computer science is, or at least was, a job driver because many or even most of its graduates would go to work for businesses writing software, often internal software, right? It's not, it's a minority, I think, of software engineers that are writing Microsoft Word or web browser or an operating system or something like that. Many more of them are focused on business applications that maybe are just run inside of a company or something like that. And advanced knowledge of theoretical computer science isn't necessarily a requirement for that kind of a job. But if business needs continue to scale past the available limits in computing power, then software needs to be dramatically refactored. For example, written in lower level languages to use more, to make more efficient use of the hardware instead of a, kind of like a stack that is quite tall at the end of the day if you're using, kind of like JavaScript or something like that. You're going through layers and layers and layers of recompilation and translation, each one of which takes a performance hit. And that's something that I think will be increasingly less viable as computing speed slows down. And if you don't do that, and this is part of the conclusion of the National Academy's National Research Council report that I cite in the book, economic growth will suffer, right? This is kind of, businesses have come to rely on the economy, really, I think, which is the main argument of the book more than any individual businesses, although I do talk a lot about, I talk a lot about platforms in the book, which are, again, a specific kind of business, and again, like a very large kind of business. But economics in general, from small business to platforms or whatever, has become more increasingly reliant on computation, such that if there's a limit to the speed of computation and we're approaching that limit, this kind of poses problems for business processes and also automation, which is the main kind of thrust of the book.
Professor, in the hardware chapters, you trace a turn from general purpose CPUs to custom configurations like FPGAs, ASICs, and GPUs. What does this shift toward specialized silicon tell us about the future division of labor between human expertise and machine efficiency?
Well, it tells us that we're looking for any and every opportunity to make chips more efficient, including by dramatically reducing their functionality, right? To do one thing best, which is kind of the ASIC model, rather than many things well, which is kind of the general purpose CPU model. FPGAs are kind of a different way to split the difference, putting software-like control into the configuration of the hardware itself. And GPUs are really interesting because almost by chance, it turns out that a lot of the operations that they are designed for in the graphical rendering space have proven to have a kind of a dual-use functionality in which they're also good operations for AI, or at least they can be converted into good operations for AI. And of course, we're gradually shedding the graphics-focused elements of those designs for AI accelerators, specifically, rather than circumstantially specialized in the functions that AI needs. So we're moving away from an era of generalized computation to an era of specific chips for specific purposes, in an effort to basically optimize for speed, because we're no longer able to just get gains from raw speed the way we have been for most of the last 60 years.
Professor, you describe contemporary AI as built on convolutional neural networks that exploit parallel hardware while allowing out human intelligence from work. How should universities and employers respond to this dual movement, overuse AI and underemployed minds, when designing education and jobs?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I'm not really sure that I have a definitive answer to it. I mean, I'm in the university space, and I mean, on an almost daily basis, we're getting emails about AI and workshops and what to do and what people are thinking. So I don't want to make it sound like I have all the answers to this. But yeah, we're in the midst of a transition that I think is hitting universities especially hard, as I was just suggesting, because we're no longer sure or as sure at least, what the purpose of higher education is, especially as it relates to the workforce. One suggestion is to teach quote unquote AI literacy. But if I'm being honest, I'm not really sure what that means because AI systems are updated every day. So the way you use them changes, number one. And number two, the whole promise of AI is that you can interact with it in natural language, right? That you no longer need to have specialized kind of constructs like programming or whatever to interact with a computer. So I'm not sure what do you teach here? Like if the whole idea is you can just speak to it naturally, and also it's changing so fast that maybe some kind of prompt that you would give one day, certainly by it's 4 years later when a student is graduating, right? Like that whatever the AI of the moment's response to that specific prompt will have totally changed, right? So I'm a little confused about that. There's obviously a need to teach AI engineering and computer science and things like that, but I don't think that's a viable path for the majority of college students or their future employers, right? Like not everybody is going to be able to or want to or ought to have to learn linear algebra or something like that in order to have a job in the next 10 years or something like that. And of course, that's compounded by other issues facing the university, like the demographic cliff here in the West, right? We have fewer students coming in than we've become accustomed to. So, you know, I mean, I think we could focus on the liberal arts and the promise of creating well-rounded, well-educated citizens. I mean, that's something that, I mean, I kind of come up through the liberal arts. So that's something that I heard a lot, as a student coming out, is that, you're designing or, you're educating people to be citizens, right? And to be kind of like well-rounded thinkers rather than for specific job skills. I do think that's very, very important. Um, but it's I would say it's even more important maybe today because we're under we're under threat from AI both economically in terms of job replacement if that if that portion of it kind of lands, as well as culturally, right? Like not just AI but social media and things like that have inculcated a preference, I think, for short form kind of bite-sized content and removed the kind of attention span necessary and the enthusiasm or willingness necessary to engage in a long form idea, like in an essay or God forbid, a book or something like that, right? So I do think that we could return to the liberal arts in some ways, and inculcate that. But going along with that should be a question of what we as humans value, so we can figure out a way for ourselves or other humans to provide it. One key point I make in the book is that we ultimately only value what labor provides. And I don't think that machinery will be able to provide everything. So education should focus on that gap, both practically and theoretically. That is, on being able to do the things that only humans can do, and thinking about what those are and how a society that values those things should be organized for the greatest good.
Professor, the book situates Silicon Valley's cultural ideology, especially its faith in continuous acceleration, within the material history of the transistor and integrated circuits. How does the approaching selling on computing power challenge the Silicon Valley self-image and its narratives about disruption and innovation?
Well, I'm certainly not the only one to notice, I hope. And I found some other people in the book and stuff that I cite, but yeah, that at a large scale, the tech industry's offerings have been kind of underwhelming for a while. I mean, where like I used to talk about the sort of the iPhone upgrade cycle, where every year there would be an announcement of a new iPhone, and it would be, like a tenth of a millimeter thinner or whatever, like 30 minutes longer battery life or something like that. I came up in the 1990s when a few years would demarcate a dramatic difference in what a computer could do, right? And we've really stopped seeing that kind of change, except maybe in for a few areas, maybe video game graphics, now AI. But for a while, it's been, kind of stagnant, just, like at a sort of high level, like an observational, like, phenomenological level, right? Um, At the same time, I think the tech industry has done a remarkable job of consolidating everything into its grasp. Almost everything we do now is digital in some way. And as people like Adam Greenfield, who I cite in the book, have noted, our phones have absorbed the function of a variety of different physical objects. So like a Rolodex, for example, a wallet, a map, so on and so forth. So we're very much in a kind of oligopoly type situation, not only for tech itself, but for many of the things it now mediates, right? A few maps companies, whatever. Conjoined to limited actual technological growth, maybe outside of AI, which again, as I was saying before, pretty much by design, often gets things wrong, goes rogue, and so on and so forth, which is creating its own backlash. So, tech is, if you sort of look at tech, I would say it's not really living up to the promises of innovation that maybe you could make the case that it, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago that it was, right? And I'm interested to see whether that kind of self-aggrandizing rhetoric of innovation, right, the way that Silicon Valley kind of celebrates itself as an innovation hub, I'm interested to see whether that's tempered the longer that state of affairs goes on, right? At some point, the concept of tech innovation will be kind of more of a vestigial concept than a current concept, and tech will be just kind of the way things are. I think it already is in a lot of ways, right? Rather than something endlessly revolutionizing itself. So the question is whether our economy can handle that. And if you look at the stock market right now, the answer seems to be no. If these oversized bets on AI are any indication, right? Like we need this kind of promise of future innovation to, basically to absorb excess capital, right? There's sort of like more capital than there is opportunities for valorization. And so that's how you get these bubbles, right? Is there's excess capital and it kind of like zooms like almost like a, air into a vacuum into an area where there's perceived future returns that are higher than, the sort of average rate of profit or something like that. So we need this as long as we're in a capitalist economy, at least capitalist political economy. We sort of seem to need this idea of technological innovation in order to keep our markets going and to keep capital turning over. So I'll be interested to see how that develops over the next 5-10 years.
Professor, drawing on Marxist theories of the reserve army of labor and long-run tendencies in capitalist development, you suggest that limits to computation could destabilize the current economic equilibrium. What scenarios do you see for employment, inequality, and social conflict in a post-Moore's-Law world?
Well, as I already hinted, I'm hopeful that we value labor and use machines to alleviate unnecessary labor rather than simply increase profits by intensifying the working day. In a way, that's always been the promise of machinery, but never, at least under capitalism, the reality, right? In an age of declining profits in general, a capitalist economy is already kind of trying to squeeze blood from a stone. And that's before any end to Moore's Law puts an end to a limit to how much computing power is available to replace or automate real world tasks. So as I talk about sort of towards the end of the book, there's of course the darker scenario in which all these technological limits result in the increase of the working day, the rollback of the kind of labor protections that have been won over the course of the late 19th and 20th centuries, at least here in the United States and in the West. I'm less familiar with the Indian context, but things like the 8-hour day and the 5-hour week is could be rolled back as the only thing that will create more value is more labor, right? So that would be like kind of the darkest scenario. But ultimately, if this pans out, the end of Moore's Law, then the value of labor will rise, which itself is a crisis for capitalism in Marx's analysis, which I cover in the book, right? The more people who are employed, the more it costs to hire an individual away from their current job. And so full employment means that wages shoot through the roof, which kind of eliminates the idea of profit, right? Like the capitalist system doesn't work unless there's that margin between how much you need to pay the worker and how much value you get out with what's called surplus value, right? Like, so if you don't have any surplus value because you're paying the worker basically the value of their labor, and you have to because there's no other alternative, right? There's no unemployed person you can pay less instead because they'll just be happy to have a job. Then obviously you can't make a profit because you're basically paying cost of you're paying the entire cost of manufacturing of production in wages plus machinery. So ultimately I think that's kind of whether in the interim it gets kind of more exploitative or whether we kind of approach this in such a way as to get ahead of it and think about that this is kind of potentially signals a fundamental transformation in the way we do business. Either way, it's eventually going to reach the same point.
Professor, you engage Professor Donna Haraway's cyborg and broader debates about labor, gender, race, and technology. How does 100% utilization complicate the more optimistic visions of hybridity and techno-feminism, especially for workers in electronic manufacturing, digital services, and platformized care work?
Well, let me start by saying that Haraway's work is foundational in a lot of fields that I'm, sort of involved with. So things like media study, critical theory, feminism, post-Soviet Marxism, right? She's one of, if not really the first, to grapple with what the computer meant for a post-industrial economy in terms of not only labor, but specifically its kind of gendered manifestations. And there's a lot to recommend in her analysis even today, some 40 years later. That said, as I go over in the book's last chapter, if you read the Cyborg Manifesto, the work that I'm mostly engaging with there, and that's probably one of the most taught essays in at least my neck of the woods. If you read it today, you might notice how much it hinges on the properties of the transistor and the microchip. At least that's what stuck out to me, when writing this book. And in an age when these electronic components are experiencing difficulties being further miniaturized, which again is an indicator of the end of Moore's law and a proxy for technological innovation. I mean, maybe I should just stop for a second and say something about that. I mean, the main thesis of the book is that, Moore's law is a process of innovation and progress that, basically says that the number of transistors on a chip will double every 24 months or so. And that is a proxy for computing power. It was a proxy for computing speed for a long time, as I said, until about 2004. And even now with multiprocessing and parallel processing and things like that, it's still a proxy for computing with just the number of transistors you can have, going at once, essentially. And this is something that, Haraway doesn't take up with Moore's law exactly, but she does take up with the idea of the microchip as being small and light and kind of, challenging, previous orthodoxies. I think a lot related to maybe stereotypical notions of industrial manufacture, certainly related to gendered notions of, kind of like patriarchal control and things like that. So if you're in a situation where these electronic components are experiencing difficulties being further shrunk, it seems essential that we try to figure out another foundation for the political ends that people like Haraway and the Cyborg Manifesto in particular are sympathetic to, aside from these concepts of microelectronics and the related, concept, as the title of the Cyborg Manifesto, indicates, of cybernetics, right? So the legacy of cybernetics is very complicated. Its founder, Norbert Wiener, was kind of a liberal with a great deal of sympathy toward the potential for technology to disrupt labor markets. He wrote about this some. And he had kind of a charitable view even of Marxism as a philosophy, which he famously described as an Augustinian rather than a Manichaean philosophy, and which he opposed, by the way, to, like really existing social, like, the Soviet Union, he considered Manichaean, but Marxism as a, as a kind of a philosophy or a mode of inquiry, right? He considered to be Augustinian, which basically means that he considered it to be a kind of science, as did Marx, that was interested in explaining, that looked at the unknowns of the world as a challenge rather than as a dualistic battle between good and evil, right? So Norbert Wiener was not, I don't want to make Norbert Wiener out to be some like arch capitalist. He's a very sophisticated thinker. And like I said, he had, fears about automation and, like a certain kind of sympathy towards Marxism as a philosophical school. But cybernetics is fundamentally about a form of control that is fluid and tolerates fluctuation within certain bounds. And that contributes to a kind of normalization enabled by signals processing, which is to say computing capabilities. So an end to computing power improvements destabilizes the cybernetic paradigm, which, not just for Wiener, but I think for Haraway is kind of the foundation of that essay, the Cyborg Manifesto. She's like, we all should be cyborgs. We should be in these kind of like human machine animal hybrids, which is very much something that you can find just in the way that cybernetics itself is trying to think through the commonalities between organic and machinic processes in order to kind of like formulate its theory of communication across them, right? If that whole paradigm is under threat by an end to improvements in processing power, that's another reason we need to begin thinking beyond both cybernetics and things like the Cyborg Manifesto.
Professor Andrew, to conclude this episode, I would like to end with a final question. The conclusion hints that new ways of being in the world are not simply needed, but imminent, as computational growth hits its limits. If policymakers, unions, and technologists took your argument seriously, what concrete experiments, economic, institutional, or technological would you want them to try first?
Well, institutionally and technologically, as I was kind of saying before, I think it makes sense to focus on lower level aspects of computation. We have accrued an enormous amount of technological debt by building operating systems on top of abstraction layers, Turing complete web browsers with the ability to execute code, and so forth. And I think we're seeing today in the performance penalties that high level frameworks, like think about like something like Node.js, incur, or the general way that RESTful web apps always seem to not quite function correctly. Errors loading if you scroll down far enough, and so on and so forth. Or like the further down you scroll, sometimes you'll get intermittent results, right? You do it again, you see different things or whatever, because it's pulling from some database and the database isn't responding fast enough sometimes, and then other times it is. So we can't keep pretending that there's no trade-off between that kind of human legible, high-level code that most sort of modern day applications and certainly kind of web applications and business applications are being written in, and the more machine compliant low-level code. So I'd recommend more attention being paid to the latter, which is obviously more difficult for people to grasp, right? I mean, that's the trade-off. But if we can focus on that in computer science curricula, jobs, and so on, I think we could at least kind of start adapting to an era where computing power is growth in computing power, I should say, is less plentiful. Computing power itself is, of course, enormously plentiful, but the growth in it is more debatable. Computing power plateaus, working in lower level languages and optimizing at the assembly level may be one of the only ways to get more efficiency out of kind of a fixed amount of computing power. Economically, in the long run, as I was kind of suggesting, I think a limit to computing power is yet another internal contradiction or breaking point in capitalist political economy. As a policy prescription, we need to really consider what would happen, both if the current push for data centers doesn't pan out and what would happen if it does, right? Because both scenarios are potentially disastrous, as many people I think are talking about right now. So on the one hand, you either have financial collapse if these bets on data centers don't work out, and the sort of like over weighting of tech and AI companies in indexes like the S&P 500 and things like that. So that's if it doesn't work out. If it does, there's of course and the promises that are being made are realized in some way. You're looking at mass unemployment, right? So it's kind of a there's kind of a bad side either way. In the long run, though, the limits of computing power will, again, I think this is the main conclusion of the book, reveal a kind of gap between machinic and human capabilities, due precisely to the imposition of abstraction layers necessary in mechanizing a process, if nothing else, right? You have to, even if you're dealing with assembly or whatever, you have to take real world phenomena and turn them into symbols that can then be computed to produce some sort of output. I mean, that's everything, right? I mean, that's not just, whatever, a website that's a robot, working on a factory line or whatever. So there's a computational cost associated with that, that, may not exist or, in sort of organic matter itself, right? And in that gap, the gap between sort of what living beings, especially human beings, can do, because labor is kind of a socially, determined category, and what machines can do, in that gap is what we call labor, right? So what we called labor 100 years ago was, is not necessarily what labor is today, because like many of the things we did 100 years ago, machines now do, right? So it makes more sense to employ a machine to do them than employ a person. And so we don't really, it's not really labor anymore. It's not the human activity that is adding value to the process. Labor is that. And so it's historically determinate. And at any given historical moment, it indexes the capacity of humanity in contradistinction to machinery to create value. And we should be creating a society in which it's that capacity, rather than automation for the sake of profit, that is the most highly respected and remunerated.
Listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into 100% utilization, computation, and labor after Moore's law, and the changing relationship between technology, work, and capitalism. Professor Andrew Lison's insights challenges us to think beyond the usual optimism about endless computing power and to confront the very real physical and social limits shaping our digital future. As we wrap up, we hope this conversation prompts you to reflect on how automation, AI, and computational limits are already reshaping your own work, organizations, and everyday life, and what more equitable, sustainable uses of technology might look like. If you enjoyed this episode, do consider sharing it with your colleagues and students interested in media theory, technology, studies, and political economy, and subscribe to Business Talk for more research-driven conversations with leading scholars. Professor Andrew, on behalf of Business Talk and all of us, thank you so much for joining today, and it has been a pleasure of hosting you, and we look forward to many more such meaningful discussions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Deepak. It was great to be here.